Have you ever experienced that peculiar loneliness that deepens with every insight you gain? That striking paradox where the more clearly you perceive reality, the more others seem to draw away from you. This isolation isn't imaginary. It's the ancient tension between profound thought and collective comfort. Society has always harbored a deep, unspoken fear of those whose minds pierce beyond accepted truths. Not because these thinkers are wrong, but because they illuminate what most desperately wish to remain hidden. The testimony of history echoes through centuries, from Socrates drinking hemlock to Nietzsche's painful isolation, from Galileo's imprisonment to Tesla dying penniless and alone. Brilliant minds have faced ridicule, silencing, and banishment, not for lack of genius, but because they held up mirrors that reflected uncomfortable truths back to a society content with comforting illusions. Arthur Schopenhauer, that unflinchingly honest philosopher of human nature, recognized intelligence, not as a gift but as a poignant burden, one that inevitably separates those who see the world with piercing clarity from those who prefer the comfort of shared delusions. But what drives this primal rejection? What makes society instinctively resist those who think beyond conventional boundaries? The answer lies in the intimate architecture of human psychology and our fragile self-perception. Consider this revealing contrast. When standing beside someone of exceptional physical strength, you rarely feel diminished. Instead, you might admire their power. Meeting someone of great wealth might trigger envy, but seldom does it provoke personal invalidation. Yet when you encounter a mind of superior insight and intellect, something profoundly different happens in the human psyche. This phenomenon, what psychologists identify as the mirror effect, reveals that a deep thinker does not merely introduce novel ideas. They unwittingly reflect back the cognitive limitations of everyone around them. This reflection becomes an unbearable weight that most cannot forgive or accept. The mere presence of someone who perceives and questions deeply can trigger profound feelings of inadequacy in others, even when the thinker remains silent. But why does intellectual depth, more than any other form of human excellence, provoke such visceral discomfort? To understand this emotional reaction, we must examine how our minds process different forms of superiority in others. Physical strength in another might cast them as a potential protector or leader. Exceptional wealth might become an aspirational beacon. Beauty might inspire appreciation or desire. These qualities, strength, prosperity, attractiveness, remain external to our core identity. We can acknowledge them without feeling our essence threatened. Intelligence operates on an entirely different psychological plane. Unlike physical attributes or material possessions, our intellectual capacity is woven into the very fabric of our identity. We define our very essence through our thoughts, beliefs, and understanding of reality. When we encounter someone who thinks with greater depth and clarity, someone who questions what we've accepted without examination, it strikes at the heart of who we believe ourselves to be. This explains why, rather than admiring intellectual depth, many unconsciously resist and reject it. Not because the profound thinker displays arrogance or contempt, but because their very existence compels others to confront uncomfortable limitations they've carefully avoided acknowledging. Throughout human history, visionary thinkers have been systematically pushed to society's margins, not simply because their ideas challenged conventions, but because they challenged something far more sacred, the fragile human ego. Reflect for a moment on your own experiences. Have you attempted to introduce a nuanced idea during casual conversation, only to watch eyes glaze over? Have you noticed how quickly topics shift when discussion ventures beyond comfortable superficiality? These aren't random social patterns, but sophisticated defense mechanisms. When confronted by intellectual depth, the human mind instinctively activates self-preservation protocols. Rather than embracing curious exploration, it retreats into defensive dismissal. This explains why philosophers, visionaries, and intellectual pioneers so often find themselves in profound isolation, not from personal preference, but because society unconsciously pushes away those who make it question itself. Modern neuroscience confirms this social dynamic. Fascinating research reveals that when people experience feelings of intellectual inadequacy, their amygdala, the brain region governing fear and threat detection, becomes dramatically active. In neurological terms, encountering superior intelligence triggers the same primal circuits as facing physical danger. The thinking mind becomes, in the most literal sense, threatening to others. This neurological response illuminates an evolutionary paradox. Throughout humanity's tribal history, survival depended not primarily on individual brilliance, but on group acceptance. Our ancestors thrived through tribal belonging, where social cohesion meant collective safety. Being cast out from the group often meant death through exposure to predators and harsh environments. This evolutionary legacy has wired human brains to prioritize social acceptance over intellectual truth-seeking. When a deeply thoughtful person enters a social setting, they unknowingly disrupt the delicate tribal equilibrium. Their presence challenges established ideas, questions unexamined assumptions, and disturbs comfortable group dynamics. This triggers the brain's ancient defense systems as if confronting a potential threat, rather than simply engaging with a more penetrating intellect. A remarkable 2021 Stanford University study revealed something particularly telling. The rejection of deep thinkers varies dramatically by social context. In one-on-one interactions, people feel relatively comfortable engaging with intellectual depth. However, in group settings, threat responses intensify dramatically. This occurs because social status concerns become paramount in collective environments. People react not merely to intelligence itself, but to how they believe others perceive them in comparison. When someone feels intellectually overshadowed in a group, they instinctively attempt to undermine or exclude the source of discomfort to preserve their social standing. This explains why profound thinkers often find meaningful connection in intimate conversations, yet struggle within larger social gatherings where status anxiety amplifies defensive reactions. Several cognitive biases further illuminate society's resistance to intellectual depth. The Dunning-Kruger effect creates an ironic imbalance. Those with limited knowledge often overestimate their understanding, while genuinely intelligent people tend towards self-doubt. This cognitive dissonance generates friction, as those who understand least confidently dismiss insights from those who understand most. Status quo bias reflects the brain's inherent preference for familiar concepts over challenging new truths. Intelligence frequently introduces disruptive perspectives that disturb comfortable cognitive patterns, triggering unconscious resistance. The backfire effect demonstrates that when confronted with information contradicting established beliefs, most people don't reconsider. They actually strengthen their original position. Deep thinkers consistently face this paradoxical response when introducing ideas that challenge conventional wisdom. In our digital era, social media algorithms have magnified this rejection of intellectual depth by prioritizing emotional engagement over substantive content. Examine the most widely shared content across platforms, Simplistic, emotionally provocative statements consistently outperform nuanced, thoughtfully reasoned perspectives. The more intellectually rigorous a person's thinking, the more difficult they find compressing complex ideas into algorithm-friendly, viral content. As a result, contemporary society increasingly values emotional comfort over intellectual challenge, entertainment over enlightenment, reinforcing barriers that profound thinkers have always faced, but now encounter in algorithmically amplified forms. The rejection of intellectual depth isn't merely a social phenomenon, it's embedded in our biology, psychology, and cultural structures. This resistance flows from humanity's deepest nature, reinforced through group dynamics, and intensified by modern technological environments. For those blessed and burdened with penetrating minds, understanding these forces doesn't mean surrendering to isolation or silencing your insights. Rather, it offers profound context for the resistance you've likely encountered. The path of the deep thinker has always demanded courage, the willingness to see clearly, even when others turn away, to speak truth, even when met with dismissal, to value understanding even when it separates you from comfortable belonging. If society inherently resists intellectual depth, what does it embrace instead? The answer reveals itself in a single word: comfort. The collective human psyche gravitates toward what soothes rather than what challenges, what confirms rather than what questions, what simplifies rather than what reveals complexity. Arthur Schopenhauer, that unflinchingly honest philosopher who peered into the human condition without flinching, recognized intelligence not as society's celebrated gift, but as a profound and often painful burden. Unlike philosophers who exalted intellect as humanity's crowning achievement, Schopenhauer discerned a poignant truth. The more perceptive one's mind, the greater their struggle to find genuine connection in a world content with surface-level existence. What transforms intelligence from blessing to burden? The answer lies in Schopenhauer's central insight into human nature, his concept of will, that blind driving force underlying all existence. Most people, he observed, live entirely governed by what he called the will to live, that primal impulse seeking pleasure, comfort, and survival above all else, steering their lives through paths of least resistance and greatest immediate reward. The deeply intelligent mind, however, undergoes a profound transformation. Rather than blindly following instinctual drives, it develops what might be called a will to truth, an insatiable longing to perceive reality as it truly exists, even when such clarity brings discomfort or isolation. This fundamental difference creates an unbridgeable chasm. While ordinary consciousness seeks pleasure and evades painful truths, the penetrating mind pursues truth even when it leads through shadows and solitude. This divergence creates a profound disconnect between deep thinkers and collective society, where most find fulfillment in relationships, entertainment, and routine pleasures. The intellectual often experiences a growing disillusionment with these diversions, seeing beyond them to deeper existential questions that haunt the human condition. Schopenhauer recognized that increased understanding of human nature paradoxically diminishes one's ability to relate easily to others. The perceptive mind sees through the intricate tapestry of social pretense, the polite fictions, status competitions, and conventional deceptions that oil the machinery of everyday interaction. Those valuing truth above appearance often find themselves unable to participate authentically in these social performances, creating a painful divide between themselves and others. They hunger for depth in a culture that celebrates simplicity. While most prefer comfortable, unchallenging conversations, the philosophical mind craves meaningful exchange that explores life's profound questions. This disparity makes ordinary social engagement feel hollow, leaving the deep thinker feeling perpetually out of place in commonplace interactions. Perhaps most painfully, they recognize the futility hiding within human desires. Schopenhauer perceived most human ambition, the relentless pursuit of wealth, power, status, even relationships, as elaborate illusions. While others chase these prizes with passionate conviction, the philosophical mind questions their very purpose, appearing distant or indifferent to what ignites enthusiasm in the majority. This is the emotional core of why intelligent people often feel misunderstood, alienated, or even resented. Their mere presence, even without intention, becomes a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths others would rather avoid. Their questions disrupt comfortable assumptions. Their observations pierce through convenient illusions, and human nature instinctively resists such disruption. Schopenhauer compared intelligence to a heightened awareness, a perception so acute it transforms the ordinary into something both more beautiful and more terrible. A high degree of intellect tends to make a man unsocial, he observed, not as criticism, but as recognition of an inevitable consequence. His logic followed a poignant sequence. The more deeply you understand, the less you can comfortably ignore. The more clearly you perceive the world's contradictions and suffering, the harder it becomes to find simple happiness within it. The more profoundly you think, the more exquisite your solitude becomes. In Schopenhauer's view, happiness and intelligence exist in inverse relationship. Far from celebrating ignorance, he simply recognized its psychological comfort, that not seeing clearly allows for easier contentment. This insight helps explain why profound thinkers throughout history, Nietzsche wrestling with nihilism, Pascal confronting the void, Kafka feeling alienated in a world gone absurd, often struggled with melancholy, existential crisis, and profound social disconnection. Yet Schopenhauer did not merely diagnose this condition. He offered wisdom for those walking this challenging path. While intelligence inevitably creates distance from conventional society, he believed there were ways for deep thinkers to transform isolation into sovereign solitude. Embrace your solitude as sacred space. Rather than viewing aloneness as punishment, Schopenhauer encouraged embracing it as privileged sanctuary. He believed profound thinkers should transform their separation into fertile ground for intellectual exploration and creative expression, rather than exhausting themselves seeking validation from a society incapable of truly understanding them. Seek your intellectual kindred. Instead of attempting to conform to mainstream sensibilities, Schopenhauer advised finding connection with fellow deep thinkers, whether through timeless books, philosophical inquiry, or those rare individuals who share your depth of perception. One profound connection with a kindred spirit brings more nourishment than countless superficial interactions. Engage with strategic wisdom. He cautioned against carelessly sharing penetrating insights with those unprepared to receive them. Instead, he suggested that deep thinkers learn to observe social dynamics carefully, understand their patterns, and choose when and how to share their perceptions, not from manipulation but from recognition that truth requires proper timing and context. These teachings offer a compass for contemporary thinkers, navigating the often painful experience of social rejection. While intelligence may indeed create distance, it simultaneously grants extraordinary gifts: intellectual freedom, penetrating wisdom, and a deeper understanding of existence itself. Schopenhauer understood intelligence as a double-edged blade, sits as a source of both remarkable power and inevitable pain. While it reveals reality with piercing clarity, it simultaneously distances one from those who prefer comforting illusions. The penetrating mind finds itself in the paradoxical position of seeing more clearly while feeling more separate. His philosophy confirms what many deep thinkers intuitively suspect. Society doesn't fear intelligence itself. It fears what intelligence reveals. The rejection experienced by profound thinkers rarely stems from their being wrong. More often it comes from being right before others are ready to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. If you've ever felt profoundly alone in your perceptions, this understanding offers a form of liberation. Your isolation doesn't indicate something broken within you. It reflects your capacity to see reality without the comforting filters most require. Your discomfort in shallow social contexts isn't social inadequacy, but a natural consequence of perceiving depth where others see only surface. Does this mean deep thinkers are fated for perpetual isolation? Or might there be ways to navigate society while preserving intellectual integrity? The reality remains that social structures aren't designed to nurture profound thought. They're engineered for stability and continuation. Most human systems prioritize comfort over truth, leading to the dominance of superficial conversation, simplified ideas, and repetitive content in social spaces. This preference for comfort over depth emerges from fundamental aspects of human psychology. Our brains naturally gravitate toward cognitive ease, preferring simple, familiar information that requires minimal mental energy. Complex, nuanced ideas trigger unconscious resistance, registered by the brain as potentially threatening simply because they demand greater cognitive effort. System justification theory further explains why people defend existing structures even when those structures harm them. Rather than questioning established authority or outdated beliefs, most instinctively rationalize them because uncertainty feels more threatening than recognizing flaws in the current system. This psychological tendency toward conformity creates environments where intellectual dissent faces rejection even when founded on demonstrable truth. The digital landscape amplifies these tendencies. Social media algorithms reward content that triggers immediate emotional response rather than thoughtful reflection. Complex ideas requiring time and attention struggle against content designed for instant emotional impact. Echo chambers develop, exposing people only to information confirming existing beliefs and making them increasingly resistant to new perspectives. Yet throughout human history, those with penetrating minds have found ways to live with meaning and purpose despite these challenges. They've discovered that while intelligence may create inevitable distance, it also offers profound gifts that cannot be found elsewhere. The freedom of authentic perception. When you no longer depend on collective approval, you gain the ability to see reality without distortion. This clarity, while sometimes painful, offers a form of liberation unknown to those who remain bound to conventional thinking. The joy of genuine connection. Though fewer in number, the connections you form with kindred minds often reach depths impossible in ordinary relationship. One conversation that touches the soul's depths brings more satisfaction than countless superficial interactions. The power of creative expression. Many of history's most profound thinkers transformed their isolation into creative works that outlived them. Their thoughts, seemingly rejected in their time, became bridges for future generations seeking deeper understanding. The privilege of intellectual sovereignty. While others remain unconsciously bound by collective thinking, the independent mind develops the capacity for sovereign thought, evaluating ideas based on their merit rather than their popularity. If you find yourself walking this challenging path, remember that you stand in a lineage of remarkable minds who transformed their isolation into wisdom. Galileo faced imprisonment for his astronomical discoveries, yet today we recognize him as a scientific visionary. Van Gogh lived and died in obscurity and poverty, yet his art now moves millions. Tesla's brilliant innovations went largely unappreciated during his lifetime, yet modern technology would be unrecognizable without his contributions. Society rarely embraces profound thinking when it challenges established norms. The recognition of intellectual brilliance typically comes only in retrospect, after its threatening nature has been neutralized by time. Yet this pattern doesn't diminish the value or impact of such thinking. It merely changes when that value receives collective acknowledgement. The path of the deep thinker has never been easy. From Socrates facing execution to contemporary intellectuals marginalized for challenging orthodox thinking, those who perceive beyond conventional boundaries have always faced resistance. Yet without these minds, without your mind, human understanding would remain trapped within comfortable but limiting boundaries. Your capacity for profound thought isn't a flaw to diminish or hide. It's a gift to be cultivated with both humility and courage. The discomfort you create in others isn't personal failure, but the inevitable effect of light entering darkness, of growth challenging stagnation, of truth disrupting comfortable illusion. Remember that throughout history, every significant advancement in human understanding came from minds willing to think beyond accepted limitations, to question what others took for granted, to endure isolation for the sake of truth. When you feel most alone in your perceptions, you may be closest to insights that others cannot yet grasp, but may someday need. The intelligent mind's journey through society requires both courage and compassion. Courage to see clearly, even when that vision brings pain, and compassion for those who cannot yet bear such clarity. It demands the strength to stand in your truth while understanding why others might resist it. In those moments when your perception creates distance between yourself and others, remember Schopenhauer's insight. This separation isn't punishment, but the necessary space in which authentic understanding develops. The very qualities that sometimes separate you from others, your depth of thought, your commitment to truth, your unwillingness to accept comfortable illusions, are precisely what allow you to make your unique contribution to human understanding. So, think deeply, see clearly, speak truthfully, not despite the challenges, but because your capacity to face these challenges reveals something essential about the nature of truth itself. The world may not always welcome your vision, but it profoundly needs what you alone can see. Society professes to value intellectual depth, innovation, and critical thinking. Yet, Schopenhauer would identify this as merely another manifestation of Maya, the veil of illusion that conceals uncomfortable truths. In reality, the collective will only embrace his penetrating thought once it has been rendered harmless by time and posthumous acceptance. This pattern reveals what Schopenhauer termed the rarity of genius, its inevitable conflict with the common consciousness of humanity. Consider these illuminating examples that Schopenhauer would recognize as the eternal drama of genius confronting mediocrity. Galileo languished in imprisonment for unveiling celestial truths that now form elementary education. Van Gogh endured the torment of poverty and isolation, his brilliance only monetized after death, prevented him from witnessing his vindication. Tesla, whose vision transcended conventional understanding, died in obscurity, while his revolutionary concepts were appropriated by lesser minds. As Schopenhauer observed, talent is like the marksman who hits a target others cannot reach. Genius hits a target others cannot even see. Society does not merely fail to recognize genius, it actively resists it while it lives and breathes. Only after death has rendered the genius safely silent does society permit itself to celebrate what it once feared. This is precisely what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote that the first generation stones the prophet, the second builds his monument, and the third erects a temple over the monument. The true indication of intellectual greatness is not contemporary acceptance, but rather contemporary rejection. If you have experienced alienation for your penetrating thoughts, know that you share the burden of what Schopenhauer called aristocracy of the intellect. Throughout history, the most luminous minds dwelled in isolation, their insights dismissed as dangerous or incomprehensible by the multitude. Their ideas violated the comfortable illusions upon which most construct their understanding of existence. As Schopenhauer noted, the more unintelligent a man is, the less mysterious existence seems to him. Socrates, whom Schopenhauer deeply admired, exemplified this pattern. By compelling others to examine their unfounded assumptions, he threatened the collective will's desperate need for comfortable certainty. His execution for corrupting youth represents what Schopenhauer would identify as the will's violent resistance to intellectual clarity. When faced with the choice between recantation and death, Socrates chose hemlock, demonstrating what Schopenhauer termed the transcendence of the will, the rare capacity to overcome biological survival instinct through intellectual conviction. Galileo's persecution illuminates another Schopenhauerian principle, the subjugation of intellect to institutional power. When Galileo's observations contradicted established cosmology, the Church, representing the organized manifestation of collective will, responded not with intellectual engagement, but with threats of torture. This demonstrates Schopenhauer's insight that religions are like glowworms, they shine only when it is dark. Institutional authority requires ignorance to maintain its control, which is why genuine intellect is invariably perceived as threatening. Nietzsche, whom Schopenhauer profoundly influenced, encountered similar resistance. His penetrating critique of conventional morality as slave morality and his recognition that God is dead threatened the psychological comfort that most derive from unexamined tradition. His dismissal as insane represents the will's desperate defense mechanism. When unable to refute genius intellectually, society questions its sanity instead. Yet, as Schopenhauer observed, all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. Tesla's vision of universal energy access threatened not merely individual egos, but entire economic systems built upon artificial scarcity. This exemplifies Schopenhauer's understanding that society operates through the principle of sufficient reason, not through what is true or beneficial, but through what preserves existing power structures. Dying alone in poverty, Tesla experienced what Schopenhauer identified as the fundamental reality of genius. The common everyday person consists of will without intellect. The genius consists of intellect without will. Turing's persecution reveals another Schopenhauerian truth: society's tendency to subordinate intellectual contribution to arbitrary moral conformity. Despite his life-saving work in cryptography, Turing was destroyed for violating sexual conventions, representing what Schopenhauer called the tyranny of opinion. Today's celebration of Turing confirms Schopenhauer's cynical observation that once the truth has triumphed, those who previously rejected it will claim they were only waiting for adequate proof. Hypatia of Alexandria, brutally murdered by religious zealots for teaching rational thought, personifies what Schopenhauer understood as the violent intersection of genius and dogma. Her dismemberment by an angry mob demonstrates his insight, that the fanatic is prepared to set fire to the world, not to discover truth, but to defend the illusion he mistakes for truth. Her gender merely amplified the threatening nature of her intellect in a society determined to preserve comfortable falsehoods. These thinkers shared a common fate that Schopenhauer would have recognized immediately. They penetrated the veil of Maya, perceiving realities too uncomfortable for their contemporaries. They experienced rejection not despite their genius, but because of it. Only after death neutralized their threatening presence could society safely incorporate their insights, proving Schopenhauer's observation that the safest way of not being very miserable is not to expect to be very happy. Does this condemn the deep thinker to perpetual isolation? Not necessarily, but it demands what Schopenhauer called resignation, the realistic acceptance of intellect's inevitable alienation. The profound thinker must navigate society with the understanding that most minds remain enslaved to what Schopenhauer termed the will to live, the blind, instinctual drive that resists uncomfortable truths. Seek out what Schopenhauer called fellow sufferers, those rare individuals capable of transcending the limitations of common consciousness. Rather than attempting to convert the masses, cultivate relationships with the few who can appreciate intellectual depth. As Schopenhauer noted, one can never read too little of bad or too much of good books. Bad books are intellectual poison. They destroy the mind. Master Schopenhauer's principle of aesthetic contemplation, the ability to communicate profound ideas through accessible representations. Einstein's dictum about explanation aligns perfectly with Schopenhauer's emphasis on clear representation as the path to understanding. The genius must learn to translate complexity into forms that the common intellect can process without triggering defensive rejection. Remember Schopenhauer's wisdom that genius is isolated by necessity, not by choice. The profound thinker sees what others cannot or will not see, and this will invariably generate discomfort among those who prefer comfortable illusion to uncomfortable reality. Yet this isolation is the necessary condition for genuine insight. As Schopenhauer observed, noise is the most impertinent of all forms of interruption. It is not only an interruption, but also a disruption of thought. If you have felt marginalized, for your penetrating intellect, take comfort in Schopenhauer's perspective. You're experiencing the inevitable fate of those who transcend common consciousness. Society not only fears profound thinkers, it requires them to advance beyond its self-imposed limitations. As Schopenhauer concluded, the person of superior intellect will be consoled for his isolation by finding entertainment in the company of his thoughts and imaginations.